All right, we're going to dive deeper into the shader by adding two new effects. The first one is going to be a selection. So we can identify that something has been selected versus something that hasn't been. And another, we're going to achieve this by giving it a border. Next, we're going to add a sheen effect to the side where we're going to demonstrate or display the player color associated with it. So let's start diving into the code. The first one I want to do is the selection. It's going to be a little bit smaller, and both of these are based off the same tech, which is Fresnel. So with my mouse down here, I'm going to hit space and start typing in Fresnel, F-R-E-S-N-E-L. But F-R-E is enough. Now the Fresnel effect is basically the idea that if you look at a wooden table, for instance, and you look straight down at it, you're going to see the wood grain. But if you look across the surface, closer to the angle of the table surface, then you start seeing reflections of whatever's sitting on it or the items behind it. It becomes more like a mirror, and that's what the Fresnel effect is. And the basic idea is that when this is at a power of 1, then if it's directly at me, the same angle, then I see black. It shows black for this. And the sharper of an angle it is, it's white. So 90 degrees would be white, but I wouldn't see 90 degrees. All right, so if I decrease this value, then the whole thing becomes white. If I bring it down to 0. If I increase it, you could call this sharpness. The Fresnel, I'll call it the sharpness, our selection sharpness. And I like about that where that is. So let's add our sharpness variable. I'm going to add a float, and we will call this selection sharpness. All right, now I'm going to drag that in, and I'm going to replace this x variable that's here of 2.91 with that. And right now it defaults to 0, so I'm going to change that to 5. 5 seems like a good number right here, for our defaults at least. Okay, so we've got our Fresnel effect. Now let's add this to our texture, to our emission map texture. So from here, I'm just going to click, and I'm just dragging that out, and I'm going to click add. I'll add it to B. And so here it is. It's got 0 plus whatever this is, so it's just literally this. And now I'm also going to add our emission map. Now our emission map had those little blue spots on it. Now this is a great way just to kind of see the output, but the emission is still just coming from the texture by itself so far. I have to replace it this way to actually see it. Okay, so I've got that in there. Now when I save this, actually let's bring up main preview. There, I'm getting this white edge around the boundary of this. Awesome. Let's save this into the assets and take a look at it over here in the scene. Okay, so here is the highlighted character. Now from a distance that doesn't stand out as much, so we're going to want to do something to increase the intensity of it. So the intensity is actually pretty straightforward to add. I'm going to create a selection intensity as a float. Its value is going to be 0 by default, and let's do that. It'll be adding a modifier, a multiplier to this. So let's go to selection intensity. I'll drag that here. Let's drag that out to multiply. And then put this one on the multiplier. So this is all black at this point, just because of the fact that the output, or that we're multiplying it by 0. But if we go up to 1, then we see that in there right away. But as I increase the intensity to say 5 or 6, you see it's got the same thing. The shading doesn't come in much farther, but it is a much more intense color. So now I'm going to add that to the text, to the emission map instead. All right, so let's save this asset. And now look at that. That stands out so much more. So if I were to zoom out, that is pretty easy to see that it's selected. And here would be unselected versus selected. Okay, I like that one. Great. This is a pretty good setup here, so I'm going to keep this, and then we're going to move on to the other one. Let's do a little cleanup first. So these Fresnel effects are doing exactly what I want. I don't need to see them unless I'm debugging, so let's save some space. Minimizing, and then let's minimize this one, and minimize this one. All right, and then let's do a little cleanup here. Excellent. All right, so that is our emission map. Now for the sheen, we're going to use basically the same style of effect. We're going to go a little bit deeper into it, but we're going to add it to the up to the texture. Now, what's the difference between the emission map and the texture? The colors of the emission map will show without a light being shown on it. So this other one, I won't be able to tell what player or something is from if it's in the dark. And honestly, I don't want units to show up if they're in the dark. I don't want to see them. I kind of like the idea that I could potentially tell that they're there by seeing little glowing eyes or something in the darkness. But other than that, I don't want to know that they're there. All right, so inside of this, let's start duplicating this effect. I'm actually just going to copy this stuff over here, the beginning parts. Control D, duplicate. So I now have these items, the Fresnel effect. I'm going to expand these back out. One thing you may have noticed is that when they were both selected and I hit the expansion, so this one and this one, and I hit the minimize or expand, they both expand. All right, so let's get these set up and cleaned up a little bit. The first thing on this, and remember, everything goes side to side here, from left to right. So I'm going to drag these over a little bit farther this way because we're going to have a little bit more to build up here. All right, so let's zoom in a little bit so I can see this stuff. And we're going to need a new sharpness on here. It's not selection sharpness, it's going to be sheen sharpness. I could call it player color, but effectively it is still a sheen. So I'm going to call this a float and call it sheen sharpness. Okay, I'm going to drag sheen sharpness in and then just replace the selection sharpness and then delete selection sharpness. Okay, that first part's set up. Next one, oh yeah, and its default value is 0. Let's replace that with, say, 5. That was working pretty well. And then over here we've got the selection intensity. We're going to create a sheen intensity. Also a float again. I'm going to drag that in and let's replace the sheen intensity, or the selection intensity. Great. Now, of course, that one doesn't show up, so let's change the numbers. 5 and 7, those seem pretty nice, but this, for a sheen, I think that effect might be a little strong. For now, let's just go with 5 and 5. Still not that much of a difference, but we'll see how that looks, and then we can change the variables, since these are things that we can change. Okay, next, I'm going to minimize this one because I don't need this original one anymore. I just need what it's creating over here. And we're going to need a negative of this one. We need to get the negative. So I'm going to output this to a subtract node. Now, I'm going to have this as B because it's A minus B, so we're going to have 1 minus whatever this is. So I end up getting the inverse. I have black on the edges, and then that fades into white. All right, so that gives us our 2 key outputs over here. So we have one that's negative. Actually, I'm going to flip this so this side comes over this way. All right. Oh, yeah, there's going to be 2 tracks. This one that has the white in the center, the majority of it being white, that's going to be mapping out to the texture. We're going to multiply this against the texture. So let's actually do that right now. I'm just going to take this value, drag it out here, and let's do a multiply. And I'm going to attach the second half of it to this texture. And now we see the texture, but the edges are cut off. Basically, we want the sheen to show the color that is associated with the player, and this is primarily red. If the player's color was blue and we added a red border to it, or we added red to it and we had the blue border, when they add, we're effectively going to get a purple out of it. And if there's purple, could be another color for a player. So that isn't going to work as well. We want to remove some of the edge so that we can guarantee that it's going to be the shader color that we want. That's why I'm using the negative here. The next one, we do want to be able to decide what color the sheen should be. So I'm now going to create a color variable and call this Sheen Color. All right, so with Sheen Color, I'm going to drag that up here. And for the output of this original one, for the first Fresnel, I'm going to drag this out and say multiply. We're going to multiply this one over here by the color. However, I want that in the opposite order. There. Now the color right now defaults to black, so let's change that. If it's red, you can see the effect immediately. Look at that. That is a really vibrant red. We can change its color to whatever we want, and we get a really rich Fresnel edge. Okay, so I'm happy with how that one's turning out. Now I want to combine these two borders together. And this space, I didn't need quite as much space as I just took, so I'm going to zoom out and drag those in a bit. I am going to take the whole selection over here, or actually let's just grab these two and drag these two away a little bit farther so I have a little more space here. All right, let's continue, and I need to add these two elements together now. So I'm going to take this one, put it on an add, and we're going to add it to the result of this one. And now we get our green border around the edge of it. As it's starting to combine, if this border were blue, we would start to see little bits of purple come through. So let's actually test that. Color, purple, we might not even be able to notice it that much, but it's there. There's definitely a little bit of purple edges starting to show up in there. Our mind usually corrects that pretty well just to say that that is blue and that is red because there's enough definition in each one, and the bleed over just looks like edges of blue versus red, not purple to us. All right, but let's go to, we've got effectively the final effect that we want. Right now, we're still based on this. Oh yeah, let's turn our selection intensity down. If I turn that to 0, the intensity won't show up here because we want our sheen to show up now. All right, we've got this one. Let's see, we need our sheen intensity. Oh, the output. I need to drag the output in to our base color. There, now this one is definitely blue on the edges. We might want to manipulate that, and we can kind of experiment and see. But now let's also take a look at our selection intensity and bring that up. We want to make sure that our selection stands out. So I'm going to put that at 5. And yeah, that certainly stands out. Okay, so I'm putting that back at 0 for now. There's our focus. I'm going to save this one. And now let's take a look at our shader, our material over here. We've got a sheen color. Let's set our selection intensity to 0, and we've got our sheen color. Now the sheen color stands out over here. It's got that nice blue rim on the edge, but down here that doesn't stand out so much. If I were to zoom in, we can start to see it, but remember, we're also going to be seeing the game from up here. So let's modify that. I want to get enough sheen intensity in there to really see it. Let's decrease the sharpness there. I'm seeing some blues show up in there. Let's zoom in and see if this still looks reasonable. That looks a little bit on the intense side. I'm starting to get some other colors showing up in there. Let's reduce that down just a little bit. Oh, my intensity is a little too bright there. There. That looks pretty good. Now, we won't be able to fully fine-tune this until we see this adjacent to other units, and I want to do that in the next section. But that effectively finishes this part. We have an intensity and we have a color sheen to be able to distinguish players. These are always things that we can improve on later, and I can still kind of see both in this effect now. Oh, and one other key thing, just to show the demo or the difference between the two. If I select the platform, I can expand it out, select the light, and turn it off. The selection still shows up, but the color does not. So the color has to be reflected from light. All right, that is effectively this one. I'll see you in the next video where we start taking on manipulating this through code and having a mouse over, for instance. All right, talk to you later.